It was the smell of burnt toast that did it. I had been standing at the kitchen counter, carefully spreading butter across 2 slices of rye bread the way I always did every morning slowly, the way my joints allowed now when my daughter-in-law walked in, looked at the toaster, and wrinkled her nose as though something had crawled in from the cold. "Again?" she said. Not good morning, not hello, just that single word, sharp as a January wind off Lake Ontario. I turned to face her. "I'm sorry, the setting was a little high. I'll open the window." She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe, looking at me the way you look at a piece of furniture that no longer matches the room. "You know what, Dorothy? It's not just the toast. It's every single morning. The smell, the crumbs." She waved her hand in a loose circle, as if the gesture could encompass everything wrong with my existence in her kitchen. All of it. My son Kevin was sitting at the table behind her. He had his phone in both hands. He didn't look up. I set down my butter knife. What neither of them knew, in that quiet moment with the smell of burnt bread between us, was that I was standing in a house that would one day bring everything crashing down. Not on me, on them. Because what Kevin and his wife Renee had never thought to ask, what they had never once considered, was whose name was on the deed. My name is Dorothy Carmichael. I am 67 years old. And this is the story of how I lost everything, slept in my car in a Canadian November, and came back to reclaim more than I had ever imagined I owned. My husband Bernard passed away 3 years ago, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in his favorite armchair with a book open on his lap. The doctors said it was his heart. I had always thought Bernard's heart was the strongest thing about him, so that still doesn't make sense to me. We had been married for 41 years. He was a quiet man, an engineer by trade, careful with numbers, careful with words, careful with everything except the way he loved me, which was extravagant and absolute and something I took for granted the way you take for granted good weather until the season turns. After the funeral, the house in Barrie felt like a museum. Every room held something of him and nothing of the future. Kevin called 2 weeks later. He lived in Hamilton with Renee and their son, my grandson Marcus, who was 8 years old and the only person in that household who still hugged me without calculation. "Mom," Kevin said, "we want you to come stay with us. Just for a while, you shouldn't be alone up there." I want to be precise about what happened next, because the comments I later read under similar stories always asked the same question. What happened to the money? So let me tell you exactly. Bernard and I had a house worth roughly $680,000 by that point. We also had 2 cars, some modest savings, and a small portfolio of investments Bernard had quietly assembled over 30 years that I knew nothing about. More on that later. When Kevin suggested I move in, he also suggested, very gently, very reasonably, that it might make more sense to sell the Barrie house rather than let it sit empty. He even offered to help manage the proceeds until I got settled, because I was grieving and overwhelmed, and he was my son and I trusted him. I signed over power of attorney. I know how that sounds. I know, but grief does something to your judgment that is difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't sat inside it. It narrows your world to the next hour, the next meal, the next time you remember to breathe. Kevin was warm and present in those weeks. He drove up to Barrie himself to help me pack. I thought I was watching my son step into the role Bernard had always hoped he would grow into. The house sold for $665,000. Kevin deposited the money into a joint account he had set up for convenience. Within 18 months, I would not be able to tell you where most of it had gone. What I would be able to tell you is that Renee had redecorated their living room twice, that Kevin had bought a new truck, and that whenever I asked about the account, Kevin said things like, "The market's been difficult and I'm managing it, Mom." Don't worry. I stopped asking. That was my second mistake. The first year in Hamilton was bearable. I had my own room, small, with a window overlooking the driveway, and I paid for my keep by cooking dinner 4 nights a week, doing the grocery shopping, and picking Marcus up from school every day. I didn't mind. I loved Marcus. And I told myself that this was what family looked like, that contribution was its own form of belonging. But Renee had her own ideas about how things should be done. She worked in marketing and brought that same instinct for control home with her. The spice rack had to be arranged alphabetically. The dishwasher had to be loaded her specific way. The sofa cushions had to be positioned at exact 45-degree angles, something I discovered only after she rearranged them 3 times following my attempts to sit comfortably. She never shouted at first. She managed through small, precise corrections, the kind that are almost impossible to object to, because each one, individually, seems so reasonable. The eggs should go on the top shelf, Dorothy. You left the backlight on again, Dorothy. Could you maybe not use the good pot for oatmeal? It scratches. I tried to adapt. I am a woman who spent 41 years making a marriage work through negotiation and good faith. I understood compromise. What I did not yet understand was that I was not in a negotiation. I was in a slow erasure. The morning she poured my coffee down the sink because I had brewed it too early and it's been sitting, I felt something shift inside me. Not dramatically. Just a quiet internal rearrangement, like furniture moving in a room 2 floors below. Kevin was there. He watched her do it. He said, "Mom, she has a point. You know how she likes fresh coffee." Then he poured himself a glass of juice and left for work. That was October of my first full year in Hamilton. By March, Renee had begun referring to my room as the spare room when she spoke to her friends on the phone. I heard her once through the wall. We converted the spare room for Kevin's mother. Yes, it's a lot. You do what you have to do. The incident with Marcus was what broke something permanent between me and Kevin. I had been helping Marcus with a school project, a diorama of a Haudenosaunee longhouse. We were at the kitchen table with cardboard and paint, and Marcus was laughing at something I'd said about the way Bernard used to make the same face when he was concentrating. And for a moment, I felt genuinely alive again, genuinely useful, genuinely part of something. Renee came home early. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the paint, the cardboard scraps, the general cheerful mess of a child doing something creative, and her expression went very still. "I told you," she said slowly, looking at me, not at Marcus, that the kitchen table is not a craft space. "We'll clean it up," I said. "We're almost done." That's not the point. Her voice had a quality I had not heard before, not sharp, but cold, deliberate. "This is my home, Dorothy. I've asked you to respect my rules." Marcus went very quiet beside me. He was 9 by then, old enough to understand the temperature of a room. "You're right," I said. "I'm sorry." That night, Kevin came to my room and closed the door. I thought he was coming to check on me. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed with his hands on his knees and said, "Mom, I need you to try harder with Renee. She's stressed. She carries a lot." I looked at my son, this man I had raised, this person I had walked into emergency rooms with at 2 in the morning when he was small and frightened, this boy I had once held in a hospital in the middle of a blizzard and promised that everything would be all right, and I said, "Kevin," she poured my coffee down the sink. He rubbed his face. "It's not just the coffee." "What is it then?" He didn't answer. He stood up, said, "Just try," and left. I understood then that there was no version of trying hard enough. I understood that I had become a problem to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. And I understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that I needed to find a way out before what was left of my dignity dissolved entirely. What I had not planned for was how quickly the decision would be made for me. It was a Friday evening in November. I was in my room folding laundry when I heard them in the hallway. I wasn't eavesdropping. The walls in that house were thin, and they had stopped modulating their voices around me the way you stop bothering to be careful once you've decided someone doesn't count. "I can't do it anymore," Renee said. "I cannot have her here. I feel like a guest in my own house." "She has nowhere to go," Kevin said, but his voice was tired, not protective. The voice of a man stating a logistical problem, not defending his mother. "That's not our problem," Renee said. "She sold her house. That money went into the account. Use it to set her up somewhere. A seniors building, assisted living. I don't care." Silence. A long silence in which I stood very still with a folded pillowcase in my hands. "Okay," Kevin said. "Just that." "Okay." He knocked on my door 20 minutes later. He had the decency to look uncomfortable, which I suppose is something. He said he and Renee had been talking and they felt it might be time for me to have my own space, that they'd looked into some options, that there was a seniors building in Ancaster he thought I might like. I asked him about the money from the house. He said the account had taken some losses and there wasn't as much left as we'd hoped, but he could give me what remained, $4,200 to get started. $4,200. From a house that had sold for $665,000. I took the money because I had no choice. I took it and I packed my 2 bags, and I spent the next 3 days in a motel on Upper James Street, sitting on a bed with a broken box spring, doing arithmetic that didn't add up no matter how many times I ran the numbers. The Ancaster building had a waiting list. Every other affordable option Kevin had mentioned turned out to have a waiting list, or require first and last, or require a credit check, or some combination of the 3. My pension was $1,100 a month from Bernard's plan. We had agreed I would stop working when Marcus was born because Renee wanted childcare from family rather than a stranger, and I had agreed because I wanted to be useful. I had no recent employment record. I had no current address. After the motel, I moved my car to a Tim Hortons parking lot on Queenston Road. I slept in the back seat with a blanket and my winter coat for 11 nights. In November, in Hamilton, I want you to sit with that for a moment. 67 years old, 41 years of marriage, a lifetime of caring for other people, 11 nights in a car in a Canadian November because my son said, okay. The cold is a particular kind of loneliness. It presses against you from outside, while the grief presses from inside, and you just exist in the middle of it, waiting for morning, because at least in the daytime you can run the engine and feel the heat. On the 5th night, a woman knocked on my window. She was perhaps 50, bundled in a parka, holding 2 coffees from the Tims inside. She had noticed me, she said, for a few days. She wasn't prying. She just wanted to know if I was all right. I told her I was fine. She left 1 coffee on the roof of my car anyway, gently, and walked away without waiting for a thank you. I cried for 20 minutes after that, not from self-pity, I think, but from the shock of simple human kindness when you have forgotten what it feels like. Her name was Gail. She became important later. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was on the 9th night that I went through the smaller of my 2 bags, the one I had grabbed quickly and hadn't fully sorted. Bernard had always called it my archive bag because I kept things in it that I should probably have thrown away: birthday cards, old receipts, photographs, the kind of accumulation that has no practical value but feels dangerous to discard. At the very bottom, beneath a Christmas card from 2019 and a photo of Marcus at age 3, I found a business-sized envelope, cream-colored, my name on the front in Bernard's handwriting. Bernard had the most precise handwriting of anyone I have ever known, every letter deliberate, every word exactly where he meant it to be. My hands were shaking from the cold and from something else entirely. I opened it. The letter was dated 4 months before his death. He had written it in his study, I realized, during those months when he had known something was wrong with his heart but had not yet told me, because he didn't want me to worry. Because protecting me from worry was something he considered a responsibility rather than a deception, though I have complicated feelings about that distinction even now. The letter began, "Dorothy, my love, if you're reading this, then something has happened and I'm not there to explain it in person. So let me explain it here." He wrote that over the course of our marriage, quietly, carefully, the way he did everything, he had been purchasing property. Not in his name, in mine. He had done it this way, he wrote, because he had always believed that a woman should have assets that belong entirely to her, a belief rooted in watching his own mother navigate widowhood with nothing to her name. He had purchased the properties through a numbered company, originally to keep things simple for tax purposes, and had registered them under my name as sole beneficiary. He had never mentioned it because he planned to tell me when he turned 70 and we sat down to do proper estate planning. He didn't make it to 70. He included the name and contact information of a lawyer in Barrie named Sandra Osei, who held all the relevant documents and had been trying to reach me. He wrote, "I asked her not to contact you at Kevin's address because I wasn't sure, and I'm sorry for that uncertainty. But I wasn't sure, Dorothy. I watched that boy, and I loved him, and I wasn't sure. Bernard had been more perceptive than I had given him credit for. I sat in the back seat of my car at 2 in the morning with that letter in my lap in a Tim Hortons parking lot in Hamilton, and I thought about my husband leaving me this safety net so carefully, so quietly, so precisely the same way he had loved me for 41 years. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I used my phone to find Sandra Osei's number. Her office was in Barrie, a 2-hour drive. She answered on the second ring, and when I said my name, there was a pause, and then she said, "Mrs. Carmichael, we have been trying to reach you for months. Are you somewhere safe right now?" I looked out at the Tim Hortons parking lot. "I'm getting there," I said. She sent a car for me. I later learned she had done this at her own expense, billing it to the estate my estate, but in that moment I simply sat in the back of a very warm sedan and watched Hamilton disappear behind me and felt something unknot in my chest for the first time in months. Sandra Osei was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the manner of someone who had seen every variety of human complication and remained unshocked by all of it. She spread the documents across her desk the way a teacher lays out materials for a lesson, methodically, each piece in its proper place. "Your husband," she said, "was a very thorough man. What Bernard had assembled, property by property, over approximately 28 years, was a collection of 9 properties across Ontario, 3 residential rental properties in Barrie, a small commercial strip in Collingwood, 2 condominiums in Hamilton, and 3 properties in a town called Dundas, just west of Hamilton, including a 12-unit apartment building on King Street." Sandra walked me through the current valuations. When she said the total, I asked her to repeat it. $11.3 million. I had been sleeping in my car. My son had given me $4,000 and called it settling my accounts. And I owned $11.3 million in Ontario real estate, all of it in my name, none of it connected to the numbered company Kevin had any knowledge of. "One more thing," Sandra said, sliding a single sheet toward me. 2 of the Hamilton condominiums are currently occupied. I looked at the addresses. Unit 14 at Stonebridge Court in Hamilton. That was Kevin and Renee's address. My son and daughter-in-law had been living in my condominium for the past 4 years, paying $875 a month under a long-term lease that Bernard had arranged at well below market rate deliberately, Sandra explained, as a way of helping Kevin get established when he was younger. A kindness Bernard had extended quietly, without expectation. At current Hamilton market rates, that unit was worth $2,400 a month minimum. I sat back in Sandra's chair and said nothing for a long time. Then I said, "What do I need to do to take full control of these properties?" Sandra smiled. "Not unkindly. That's why you're here. There is a particular kind of power that comes not from anger but from clarity. I had spent months being afraid, being cold, being diminished. Sitting in that office in Barrie, I didn't feel rage. I felt, and this is the only word that fits, settled. Like something that had been knocked sideways had righted itself, like a compass finding north. I spent 4 days in Barrie sorting through documents, signing papers, establishing a property management company Sandra recommended called Heron Ridge Holdings. The name mattered to me. Bernard had loved herons. There was one that visited the pond behind our Barrie house every spring, and he would stop whatever he was doing to watch it. The first operational change we made was straightforward. All existing leases would be reviewed. Where below market rates existed, tenants would receive proper legal notice of rent increases in alignment with Ontario Regulations 90 days notice, by the book, every step documented and compliant. The Hamilton condominium, where Kevin and Renee lived, would move from $875 to $2,200 per month, phased in over 2 notices as legally required. I want to be clear about this. I did not set out to destroy my son. I set out to be treated like a human being with legal rights, which is a different thing, though the outcome can sometimes look similar from the outside. Sandra arranged for me to stay temporarily in one of the vacant Barrie properties, a small bungalow on Penetang Street, while I got myself sorted. I bought warm clothes. I made an appointment with a doctor because 11 nights in a car had done things to my back that needed addressing. I sat in a warm kitchen with proper coffee, and I began, slowly, to remember who I was before grief had hollowed me out. Gail, the woman from the Tim Hortons parking lot, had written her number on the coffee cup she'd left on my roof. I had kept it. I called her. She was surprised and then not surprised. She invited me for dinner. Over pasta and wine in her kitchen in East Hamilton, I told her the outline of what had happened, and she listened the way people rarely listen, without interrupting, without advising, just receiving it. "What are you going to do?" she asked when I finished. "The legal thing," I said, "which happens to also be the just thing. I've found those are often the same." The first rent notice arrived at Stonebridge Court on a Tuesday. Sandra told me Kevin had called the property management office within the hour. He told the property manager there had been a mistake, that this unit was subject to a special long-term rate, that he wanted to speak to the owner directly. The property manager relayed a message back. The previous rate had been a courtesy arrangement by the former informal owner. The estate had been formally transferred. Market adjustments were effective immediately per legal notice. Kevin called 3 more times that week. He was told each time that the owner was not available for direct discussion with tenants. A month later, Sandra updated me. Kevin and Renee had missed the first adjusted payment. They had paid the old rate instead, with a note attached saying they were disputing the increase. Sandra sent them a formal notice to pay or vacate, as required under the Residential Tenancies Act. Everything by the book, everything documented. Renee, I was told by the building's manager, had begun asking other tenants whether they'd also received increases and whether anyone was considering a collective complaint. 2 tenants had received increases, legitimate, legal, documented. None of them joined her effort. I heard, through the property manager, that Kevin and Renee's fights had become audible through the walls. That Kevin had apparently not known the condominium belonged to anyone connected to me. Bernard had used the numbered company from the beginning, and Kevin had never thought to ask whose property he was renting so cheaply. Renee, according to the building manager who had lived next door for 2 years and found the situation professionally awkward, was furious that Kevin had not investigated more carefully before they built their lives in someone else's space. It is a particular flavor of justice when the consequences of a thing land on the person who was careless with it. 6 weeks after the first notice, Kevin was behind by 2 months. Sandra filed with the Landlord and Tenant Board. The process is slower in Ontario than people imagine. There are hearings, there are timelines, there are legal protections for tenants that exist for very good reasons, and I respected all of them because I was not interested in doing to someone else what had been done to me. I was interested in the outcome of following every rule exactly as written. The hearing was on a Wednesday in February. I was not required to attend. Heron Ridge Holdings was represented by Sandra's associate, a younger lawyer named Paul Fernandez who knew the file well. But I went. I sat at the back of the hearing room in a gray coat and watched. Kevin looked exhausted. He had lost weight. There was something diminished about the way he held himself, not broken, exactly, but compressed. Renee sat beside him in a stiff blazer, and I could see her jaw working the way it did when she was controlling herself carefully. Their lawyer argued that the increase had been too sudden, that the previous rate had been established over many years and constituted an implied agreement, that the tenants had organized their financial planning around it. Paul Fernandez laid out the documentation, the legal notice, the proper timeline, the amounts, the compliance with every regulation. The adjudicator asked several questions. The answers were all in the paperwork. The ruling came. Tenants had 30 days to pay the outstanding balance or vacate the premises. Renee stood up sharply. She said something about corporate landlords and predatory rent practices. The adjudicator noted her comment and asked her to be seated. I watched Kevin. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He just looked at the table in front of him with an expression. I recognized the expression of someone understanding, for the first time, what it feels like when the floor gives out beneath you. I left before they could see me. Sandra called me that evening. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" "Tired," I said. And then, calm. Both were true. I did not hear from Kevin for 3 weeks. Then one morning, my personal phone rang the number I had not changed, the one he'd always had, and I sat with it in my hand for a long moment before answering. Mom. His voice was stripped of everything except the word itself. Kevin. A pause that went on long enough that I could hear him deciding what to say and discarding option after option. I didn't know, he said finally. About the building. About any of it. I know you didn't. Renee's at her sister's place in Oakville. Another pause. I got a room in a shared house on Concession Street. I looked out the window at the berry yard, where the snow was finally beginning to pull back from the grass. Are you working? I asked. Yes. I'm working. He cleared his throat. Mom, the money from your house. I need you to know Renee managed that account. I should have paid more attention. I know that's not an excuse. No, I agreed. It isn't. He didn't say sorry. I found that I respected him more for it than if he had, because sorry is easy, and Kevin had never been comfortable with easy. He said instead, I'm trying to figure out who I want to be. That's a good place to start, I said. We didn't speak for another 2 months after that, but the call was a kind of door, and I left it open. I spent that spring doing things I had abandoned for too long. I found a watercolor class at the Barry Public Library on Tuesday mornings, run by a retired art teacher named Francis, who had opinions about pigment and no patience for self-doubt. I went back to the garden Bernard and I had planted together, and I dug up what the winter had killed and put in something new. I had coffee with Gail on weekends, sometimes in Barry, sometimes in Hamilton, and we talked about everything except the obvious, until one afternoon she said, You know what I notice about you? You don't talk about the future like it belongs to someone else anymore. She was right. I had spent 18 months living in a present that felt like waiting for something worse. Now the present felt like mine again. Sandra helped me establish a proper charitable trust using a portion of Bernard's estate. I named it the Heron Ridge Foundation because Bernard would have liked that. Its first initiative was a partnership with a Hamilton organization providing transitional housing for women over 50 who had lost stable housing due to domestic situations, financial dependence, or family breakdown. The intake coordinator told me at our first meeting that my description of what I wanted the foundation to address was the most specific she had ever heard from a donor. I told her I had done my research from the inside. In September, Gail and I drove out to Dundas for a weekend and walked along the Dundas Valley trails in the rain, and she told me about her own divorce 8 years earlier, and I told her about Bernard, the real Bernard, not the grief version I'd been carrying, but the actual man, the herons, the handwriting, the way he always made coffee too strong and pretended not to know it was too strong, the 41 years of small, accumulated kindnesses that are so easy to overlook until they're gone. He sounds like someone worth grieving properly, Gail said. He was, I said. He was also someone who never stopped trying to protect me, even after he was gone. I've been angry about the secrecy, but I've stopped being angry. He knew what he knew. Kevin called again in October, on a Sunday evening. He was in a different job now, logistics management for a warehouse in Stony Creek. He asked, carefully, whether I would have lunch with him sometime. I said yes. We met at a Vietnamese restaurant in Hamilton on a Wednesday. We were both careful with each other in the way people are when they're handling something fragile and valuable and aren't sure yet of the weight of it. He asked about the foundation. He asked about Barry. He asked about Francis and the watercolor class. I asked about his work and his room on Concession Street and whether he was eating properly. Toward the end of lunch, he said, I've been seeing a therapist, trying to understand how I let things get so far. I nodded. She says I learned to manage conflict by becoming invisible, and that I applied that to you because you were safe and Renee wasn't. He looked at his tea. That's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. I know the difference, I said. We didn't resolve anything that afternoon. We didn't need to. We paid the bill and walked out into the October air, and Kevin put his hand briefly on my shoulder before we went to our separate cars, and I thought, this is how something broken begins, slowly, to become something different. Not repaired, different. Perhaps even better for the honesty it now requires. The last time I saw Renee was by accident, in a grocery store in Hamilton in November. She was in the cereal aisle. She saw me and went very still. I nodded. She looked away. That was all. Some things don't require a conversation. I am sitting now on the back porch of the Penetang Street bungalow as I tell you this, with coffee that is strong the way I like it, watching the first snow of the season make the garden quiet and clean. Marcus comes to visit most Saturdays when Kevin brings him. Kevin and I are not yet what we were, and we may never be, but we are building something honest in its place. And that is more than I had in November of last year. I have learned things this year that I want to say clearly, because if you have listened this long, you deserve honesty in return. Do not sign over financial control to anyone, not your children, not your spouse's children, not anyone without independent legal advice. Love is not a reason to give up your autonomy. Love coexisting with legal protection is simply wisdom. Document everything. Know what you own. Know what your partner owns. Have a lawyer you trust, and make sure they know how to reach you. Bernard's greatest gift to me was not the properties themselves, it was the fact that he had Sandra Osei's card in an envelope with my name on it. If you are a woman who has spent her life in the work of care, raising children, managing households, supporting a partner's career, organizing the invisible infrastructure of a family, that work has value. It is not repayment for housing. It is not a fair trade for being tolerated. You are not a burden for existing in a space. You are a person. And perhaps most importantly, if you find yourself at the bottom in a motel with peeling wallpaper, or in a car in a parking lot, or on a bench wondering how love became something so disposable, know that the bottom is not the end of the story. It is often just the place where the real one begins. To anyone who has been cast out of the place they were promised would be home, you are not finished. You are not too old. You are not without resources, even when you cannot yet see them. Stand up slowly if you need to. But stand up. My name is Dorothy Carmichael. I am 67 years old. My husband left me everything he had and the instructions to fight for it, and I did. I planted something this spring that I will watch grow for years. Bernard always said that was what gardens were for, not the season you're in, but the one you're growing toward. The snow is settling on the roses now. They're still there under it. They'll be back.